altruism. There are more people still coming, but we're already 8 minutes into our time. Anitra Nelson has been a real friend of the MEP. This is, I think, the 4th year you have spoken with us, Anitra, maybe even 5 years at this point. But today I'm very happy to welcome Anitra for her newest book, Beyond Money, a Post-Capitalist Strategy. And this book just came out in the chat. If you are here and looking over at your chat screen, everybody, Anitra has put the link for buying this book at a very good discount. But before you do that, I am going to turn the floor over to Anitra. So Anitra, welcome Beyond Money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, and many thanks for everyone else for coming. I start this talk with an acknowledgement of elders past, present and emerging of the Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands I live and work, and similarly of elders past, present and emerging of the Gunai and Kurnai peoples, on whose land I was born. I also extend my deepest sympathies for the Ukrainian peoples and all others living with unjust attacks on their lives and livelihoods. I live in a settler society known as Australia in a southeastern region called Central Victoria in a Nazi rural town called Castlemaine. Here it's 8:10 on Sunday the 27th of January.
Darling.
The text in the flyer for this event pointed out that radical approaches to achieving post-capitalism tend to target capital, yet leave money and markets in visions and strategies towards post-capitalism. By money, I mean monetary values as in prices and daily monetary activities in trading and relations of debt and credit. The question I've asked myself for over 50 years now is, what if money is the barrier to us achieving ecological sustainability and social equality? Because undoubtedly, these are the two greatest challenges facing us as humanity today: inequities between people and unsustainability in every dimension of our relations with Earth. The curious thing is that we know how to live sustainably, but market-based economies, which of necessity centre on monetary calculations, prevent us from instituting the social and ecological measures required for healthy and peaceful coexistence among ourselves and with other living beings. We have food on shop shelves, but won't let people access them unless they have or have enough money. People are disadvantaged, even punished, unless they agree to satisfying their needs through paid work in the market economy and market exchange. State welfare reveals the state both as a bulwark and a support of capitalist economies. So, of course, a key reference point for Marxists is Karl Marx's Capital. Significantly, Marx starts his analysis with the monetized good, the commodity, and highlights exchange value, which, like capital, can't be defined without reference to money. If Marx harped on about capital and derided monetary reformists, how is it that so many socialists maintain exchange value, money, at least it's to some extent, when they float a proposal for a world that goes beyond exploitation of one another and Earth? Doesn't that keep the door open for capitalists? Well, it's questions like these that prompted me to do a PhD on Karl Marx's concept of money. I'd been a Latin American history undergraduate, and all Latin American recent history seemed to me to reduce to economics. Then I embarked on an MA thesis on Mexico's foreign public debt before it exploded in the early 1980s with the threat of necessary moratoriums. And the key question I had of all the material before me was, So what is money, the substance of debt? Much earlier, as a teenager, I'd become an environmentalist and immediately confronted not just the power of capitalists, but their monetary logic, which we found undermined all efforts to argue for appropriate development. I was a creative writer and initially worked part-time in a bookshop. Then I disbanded school and worked there full-time. I experienced the retail end of book production, which gives writers a status akin to that of farmers, receiving around 5 to 10% of what the consumer pays for the product of their work. In the industry, I saw writers manipulated as contract or piece workers for capital. And as an activist in the women's movement, I encountered a whole different set of contradictions around monetary work and unpaid work, caring for families. So my doctoral thesis was completed in a philosophy department supervised by a lapsed anarchist who knew his Marx and economics and was head of interdisciplinary revolutionary studies. Those years enabled me to examine money in depth. I discovered non-market socialism, with which I identified. Non-market socialists are a motley crew whose distinguishing feature is to argue for immediate and broad-scale non-compliance with the non-monetary economy that supports capitalism. That's with the monetary economy. I was excited to find that in the early years of both the Cuban and Russian revolutions, there were debates specifically on the role of money in a transition to socialism. Moreover, this century, we find certain intentional communities and other organised practices that are consciously non-monetary, so social and ecological values can be their prime concern. 10 years ago, I and the late Franz Timmermann co-edited a Pluto Press non-market socialist collection with numerous contributors, Life Without Money, Building Fair and Sustainable Economies. This brought together, for instance, the anti-money, zero-work arguments of autonomous Marxist Harry Cleaver and the work of philosopher John O'Neill. O'Neill shines a light on Otto Neurath, a central figure in the Vienna Circle and the socialist calculation debates, who argued that there is no way of achieving socialism without an in natura economy, an economy in kind that operates directly in terms of what I call real values. Life Without Money caused a stir. Consequently, Pluto Press encouraged me to write another book on the topic. It took me a long time, but Beyond Money, a Post-Capitalist Strategy is that book. So what I intend to do is to talk a bit about the chapters, some of the details within each chapter, and about how the whole argument hangs together. A framing in terms of abolition is tempting, but I prefer to direct attention to the constructive aspect of this direction, which I call real valuism. I must thank here John Holloway, who wrote the introduction and has a book being published by Pluto Press later this year, also arguing for going beyond money. My analysis draws particularly on critical readings of the work of autonomous Marxism, of the Midnight Notes kind. Harry Cleaver, Silvia Federici, Cavensis, and Hans Widmar, also known as PM. All, like Marx, position themselves beyond our conjuncture and on ethics of equity and human freedom. The final part, for instance, that's part 3 of this book, Harry Cleaver's Rupturing the Dialectic, focuses on breaking away from money. I found it quite difficult to create a readable book, a clear, unapologetic work that both convincingly stated the case against money and offered a vision and strategy for going beyond it. My first attempts had one half explaining how money worked within capitalism, a little like a textbook, and a shorter half on moving beyond money, which read more like a manifesto. This approach utterly failed because my point of departure beyond money came too late after all the boring aspects of how money functions and how it constrains us. So in the end, I completely revised the structure and settled on a form that enabled me to state my case right from the start. I integrate criticisms of alternative currencies, equal exchange and fair trade through various chapters in easily digestible and activist relevant ways. The first chapter positions us in the current conjuncture of two great crises for capital, global inequities and unsustainabilities. I show how these challenges result from the dynamic of money, from how money operates. I position that capital and money are conjoined, while I posit that capital and money are conjoined as chicken and egg, that the state acts as both a bulwark against capital and its ultimate support, and that makes it a capitalist state. I write about the main functions of money, the universal equivalent, as Marx and others call it, and emphasise the primary importance of the unit of account function. I outline that going beyond money does not equal barter, because barter actually embodies the conceptual seed of money as we know it. Moreover, in the first chapter, I outline the concept of real values, which has certain similarities with the concept use value, inasmuch as both relate to qualities and purposes of things. Yet real values go beyond mere use values to refer to actual and potential diverse values of living beings, plant, animal and rock in landscapes and the atmosphere, all relevant not only to actual and holistic human needs, but also ecological needs. So an infinity of real values fill the entire space of a non-monetary economy. We call a spade a spade. Its uses are what we can do with it, and its values involve its whole material constitution, inclusive of what that means for Earth. Moreover, most real values relate to specific communities within their residential ecological locales. So real values are contextual in time and space, socially and ecologically. They can change readily. So I point out that even if a rich elite is most influential within the market economy, in reality, no one in particular manages any market. It's a freewheeling and all-encompassing set of flows and activities stitched together by price signals and other monetary relations. In this market-based wonderland, money is a quasi-god. Even the power of multi-billionaires and monopolies is limited by being simply more influential in rather than driving the system. In short, all of us, rich and poor, have handed over control of our livelihoods to money, to monetary calculations that are irrational in terms of social and ecological values and outcomes. So, especially given the environmental crises surrounding us, we might actually commit species suicide if we don't immediately get into the driver's seat and collectively move away from monetary practices. Chapter 2 delves more deeply into the functions of money, but in ways that can engage with contemporary movements, reforms, and radical impulses such as the degrowth movement. I argue that capitalism cannot operate in reverse. Private production for the market has no operating systems for reducing or degrowing. Profit making is an essential buffer systemically created within production for trade to enable enterprises and associated individuals to operate. And economic growth is simply a generic result of that dynamic. So degrowth requires going beyond money. In that chapter, I elaborate on some of the traditional contradictions and conundrums presented by money. For example, all the talk of free trade, free will, and voluntary acts, whereas we know from daily experience that there is force and limits, pressures associated with meeting basic needs from the market that we have no choice in at all. Equally, money might appear natural and necessary, but it's actually wholly social and even unnatural. So what might a world beyond the discipline and constraints of the market look and feel like? And how would it operate to meet our basic needs? Chapter 3 sets out an alternative, producing on demand. So I'm going to ask you now to suspend disbelief around how we'll get there, because I'll talk about transitionary strategies later. Chapter 3 is exclusively about Yenamon, a world beyond money based on real values and substantive direct democracy. So come with me and imagine a global network of collectively sufficient cell-like communities, each responsible for the sustainability of the local environments of which they live. Communities of variable sizes, bioregions offering direct and efficient forms of production. Producing locally as close as is feasible to end users. Imagine each diverse small community caring for Earth as in their locales, empowered, relatively autonomous, organised horizontally, internally, seamlessly networked locally and globally. We have personal property, but no private property. The entire Earth is commons with clear and universal principles for commoning, sharing land through secure and fair use rights. Everyone contributes a set amount of hours per week to collective production, and in return, their basic needs are met. How? Each household guesstimates their basic needs annually, a list that's checked by others, other working groups, and yet other working groups report on the capacity of the local area and capability of locals to fulfill various needs. Together, everyone plans on who gets what and how it will be produced. Then they work and monitor and tweak how they will fulfill those orders all through the year. Goods and services are produced for particular, already identified people, so we don't need money or markets. We know who's ordered what, so everything is that's produced is distributed according to those pre-identified people and needs. Once established, planning mainly relies on updating previous calculations and taking account of seasonal, natural and human factors and changes. We discuss and negotiate compacts to produce for and receive from neighbouring and more distant communities goods and services that satisfy needs we can't fulfill locally. Compacts are like contracts, they are agreements, but they're non-monetary and they operate on principles of mutual support, like our internal relations. Overconsumption and waste is minimised. We pass on or leave things we don't need in spaces for others to use. Collective stores are for emergencies and to fulfil unexpected gaps. Here, grassroots decision-making replaces production for trade, market exchange and money. Decision-making focuses on real biophysical, environmental and social measures and values. The reward for contributing to collective daily tasks is the lifelong security of having our basic needs met. We engage together respectfully to make decisions on local production and the terms of exchange, the compacts, with our neighbouring producers. So real social and ecological values offer the democratic and materialist terms for replacing money as the organising principle of society. Consequently, the transition will involve moving from global production for trade for the market to production on demand in a community mode of production. Having sketched out global commoning here early in the book, I can easily show how anti-money and real value voices, as well as models for non-monetary practices, have developed and are emerging from environmental and social movements, like currents flowing in the same direction towards a real value future. So the other 5 chapters in Beyond Money deal with the environmental movement, the women's movement, alternative technology, Indigenous people's rights and commoning, and a movement of movements to occupy the world. So I think that what might be most useful now in the last 10 minutes of my talk is to briefly cover those 5 chapters so that then you can nominate topics and questions that you're most interested in hearing more about, as well as toss in original questions or comments to me. Chapter 4, System Change, Not Climate Change, shows how capitalist market-based practices establish and reproduce human nature dualism. Mainstream responses to climate change show failings in monetary mechanisms such as carbon offsetting and water trading. I examine key weaknesses in pricing the environment, like what price a forest, what price a bay. I show how some alternatives, such as an energy standard, energy, as Odom called it, entails similar problems to money because they centre on simplistic, erroneously reductive comparatives. I refer to the many critics of treating Earth as a monetised resource and end with Neurath's arguments for an in-kind economy and the refrain that ends the nature-human dualism with the insight, we do not defend nature, we are the nature that defends itself. Similarly, the chapter on women's liberation courses its way through debates on paid and unpaid work. What is value? Did Marx get value wrong? The subsistence economy of ecofeminists such as Maria Mies, and the broken chains between global north and south, rich and poor women. The discussion reveals how markets marginalise certain activities and how exchange value, that's simply value in political economy, fails to represent or measure real, humane and ecologically significant values. Instead, liberation depends on us adopting commoning, caring economies of sufficiency where all contribute and everyone gains a modest livelihood. For German economy advocate and queer feminist Friederike Habermas, we must move beyond money as in actually existing barter-free, exchange-free communities in Germany. Chapter 6 takes a different slant, discussing capitalist and alternative technologies and techniques. Technology is a key topic in many movements, and it divides approaches to transitionary strategies and visions of post-capitalism. Sophisticated technologies advance capitalism as a frontier for absorbing the growth in money capital in search of investment opportunities. This is the capitalist promise of Green New Deal measures that rely on further material exploitation, including toxic rare earths, and show little concern for directly meeting basic needs. Debts mount in capitalism as a function of the formation of capital assets, and many of those capital assets are constituted in technology itself, and that's the shadow of what I call a real debt cycle between workers and capitalists. Some post-capitalist imaginaries are studded with sophisticated technologies as a means of liberation. But I, like many degrowth advocates, argue for appropriate technologies. These are simple or sophisticated, but always convivial tools, attractive for their compatibility with horizontal decision-making and light impacts on Earth. By convivial, I mean user-friendly. Somewhat similar to Yenomon, New York literary and cultural studies scholar Kristen Ross contemplates current eco-socialist struggles while reflecting on the Paris Commune to present a vision of emancipation based on commons, collectively owned land with regional collective sufficiency and political economy. Nature, writes Ross, would then be not just a productive force or stockpile of resources, but valued as an end in itself. Wealth would not rely on technologies, but rather techniques of living in a relationship with nature that was creative and celebratory. The penultimate chapter draws on institutions of contemporary Zapatista and Kurdish liberation communities, non-monetary practices that arose during the Spanish Civil War, and the millennia-long practices of Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have constantly struggled against and alongside capitalism to maintain their substantive rights to practice traditional and appropriate collective provisioning. Historically and currently, exchange value paradigms and practices have challenged, smothered and isolated non-monetary practices and modes of production based on ecological and social values. In response, Uruguayan writer of both fiction and non-fiction, Eduardo Galeano, calls for a community-based mode of production, highlighting real social and ecological values to be strengthened and expanded, inclusive of diverse cultures and practices. I argue that a successful post-capitalist movement will not simply embrace and partner Indigenous peoples' cultures and economies, but will be informed and driven by them in key strategic and structural ways. The propelling and generative force of post-capitalism is highly conscious and conscientious political decision-making, way beyond the commodification of capitalism, beyond cooperatives that rely on market exchange, beyond community currencies or community banks. Instead, we need to perceive the world in terms of real social and ecological values, with practices based on direct decision-making over existing local conditions and our potential to satisfy simultaneously the needs of Earth and all people. As to be expected, the final chapter is something of a call to arms, to occupy the world. I identify really constructive aspects of 21st century movements that seem unorganised and disorganised to the union movement and party left, and to radicals who envisage a state takeover. I try to show the creative, constructive and liberating aspects of horizontal organisation, non-violent resistance and action with networked movements of relatively autonomous nodes working locally, dynamically. All this, I argue, is not too distant from Marx's vision of a new materialism, which highlights human agency. That's it.
Done, Anitra? Thank you. So,
any questions? Do you want to outline, Michael, about popping questions in chat?
yes, people can write the word stack in chat or raise your hand. However, because there are two screens, I may not see your raised hand if you do that option. Oh, Megan is asking about, Anitra, I'm going to move your, I'm going to cut and paste your link to the book and the discount to everyone.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Is that not gone to everyone?
Well, the thing about chat is as people write in it, what you wrote starts to not be as visible.
Sure, that's fine. I can see also that Joel has asked, are there any models created to represent that economic vision? So in actual fact, this is sort of, this is based to some extent on theoretical work, but more particularly, I lived during the 1990s in an effective commune, and this was based on a community in the United States in Virginia called Twin Oaks. So it's in a sort of but in the one that I lived in was in Australia, okay. And I've also visited Twin Oaks. So if we're looking at a community of 100 people that is trying to be as collectively sufficient as possible, you know, there's a kind of example, and there are other sorts of intentional communities that have developed over the years that organise themselves internally on with one purse is often how they're referred to. So I explain that in the chapter that I've written on Yenamon, that it's kind of like based on those experiences. I also lived in a less communal cooperative of around 25 households that were nonetheless collectively managing an area of land for conservation purposes, and that particular cooperative has practices that have been shared with the local community by way of an environmental living zone that covers maybe around 150 households. And so each of those kind of communities show the special characteristics of acting collectively as if the land were in common with direct participatory democracy, pretty much on these horizontal bases where positions that people hold can be challenged. They're regularly rotated, and people are encouraged to learn as many skills and as much knowledge as possible so that they could fulfill as many of those different roles as possible. There are these barter-free and exchange-free communities in Germany that arose partly out of the alter globalization movement. And I've got lists of these. I've got sort of select reading and links at the end of my book to these kinds of things. There's a network called Demonetize It, where people who advocate money-free societies get together. So that's on the internet. And in this book, Degrowth in Movements, the Demonetize It have a chapter about that network and about the arguments. I suppose that what also, like we've got free university movements, we've got community gardens. There's a range of different kinds of solidarity and mutual support organisations, which are, like in substantial areas and or sectors operating in similar ways. Again, resources are kind of seen as commons. Basic needs is what the aim is to meet, and the relations between people sort of tend to be lateral and horizontal. There's a number of different ways of people looking at economies, such as caring economies, which goes way beyond caring sectors, as they're referred to in mainstream economies, but actual concepts of a caring economy, which means that you look at everything that you're doing as care. I mean, it's very easy for artists, for creative people to understand that because you care about things. It's easy if you're a farmer or you're a gardener to understand your relationship to earth and to what you're producing as care. In my particular area, I'm going to embark on a kind of audit of our area to try and work out, and when I say area, I'm looking at a kind of small bioregion of around 10,000 or 20,000 people, and the area that our local kind of council covers. And I'm going to try and work out to what extent we are self-sufficient and could be a lot more self-sufficient. Because what I find is that a lot of people are completely unconvinced that small areas could be as collectively sufficient as I imagine that they could be. But from if one looks at Twin Oaks, for instance, which is around, and these kind of proportions are fallacious to some extent, but if you say it's 70% collectively sufficient, then that's quite substantial, and it could be a lot more.
So, Anitra, do you want me to read out what's in the chat? Because that's where most of the comments are coming.
Yeah, great.
Joel, I'm going to do other people besides Joel first and go to Joel last because he already asked. Megan from Minnesota has asked, what other thinkers do you recommend we read who write on the caring economy, particularly with a feminist lens? And then Lucci has written the most prominent effort I'm aware of prior to your book that is organizing some of these principles as the Solidarity Economy Network. And then Harry is asking to describe what degrowth is. And then, well, that's enough. That's quite a bit right there. And then we'll go to Joel, who is really, Joel is only asking about Mondragon, which comes up. It used to come up a lot more at almost every, no matter what our topic was, but he's asking about Mondragon and your take on that.
Okay, so degrowth. Okay, so degrowth is basically working, producing and consuming within Earth's limits. And so in terms of the global north, and wealthier people who are living beyond their needs, it's about people reducing production and consumption, but at the same time, for those billions of people who aren't even getting enough, or enough nutritious food to eat. It's about improving their sustainability as human beings, and their livelihoods. So degrowth is often assumed when one first hears it, that you might have images of poverty and austerity. The best way of looking at degrowth is to think about those other words like dematerialization. It's about breaking things apart and collapsing them. It's not about decreasing in a pure sense. So degrowth is to growth as quality is to quantity. So growth, as we use the term in our economies, is all about more amounts, increasing monetary valuation of things.
Quantity.
Yeah, quantitative. And degrowth is all about quality, very much. You know, this is where the whole kind of emphasis on real values comes from. And in terms of the feminist references that have been called for, so I suggest FADA, F-A-D-A. So that's all capitals except for the first A. If you look up, that's Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance, and you can find information about them at degrowth.info, which is the international hub for the Degrowth Network. And they have a Twitter account, and they're just actually in the throes of putting out a primary document, several page document, as well as a kind of like one-page manifesto. They've already put one out, but it's an updated one. And a lot of the work of people who are involved with that network are on caring economies in this very holistic version of it. And in terms of Mondragon, so like Mondragon is actually a good example of what all the problems are with seeing cooperatives as the answer. So, and from examples such as Mondragon, people sort of said, okay, we could just have all of production created like cooperatives, and that would break capitalism and move us to a much better world. Now, the problem is that Mondragon actually shows also in empirical fact what the real problems are with moving in that direction, because you're still producing for the market. Now, if you actually want to produce for communities, for people, for their basic needs, they actually need to be part of that discussion. And the majority of cooperatives, however integrated, however flat they are in terms of hierarchy within the organisation, they're the workers there deciding. And I certainly support, workers in control as an improvement on where we are at the moment, and cooperative structures as improvements, but it's not actually getting us to a new world. Interestingly, the point is that, as I say, what we're doing by having markets is actually handing over our otherwise power to collectively govern ourselves and work out what's produced, how it's produced, for whom and when. So my criticism of cooperatives, and in the Mondragon form, a lot of them are producing for the market, well, then that's the key problem as I see it.
There are more questions. So these are pretty long. Let me see. There is Julianne. Thank you for your presentation and utopianism. I'd like to ask how to maintain a certain vision of modernity, emancipation, and progressive values with a model based on small autonomous communities? Or is this vision of small communities ultimately biased? What do you think? Then I'll go to Mike Santangelo, who asks, this all reminded me of the Zeitgeist movement and the Venus Project. I love Jacques Fresco's book, The Best Money Can't Buy. And then Lucille will go, can recycling and conservation address a lot of these basic needs problems? Then Lucille has asked, as you can see in chat, have you looked into sovereign or just money reform? That is, monetary reform that shifts us from our current private interest-bearing debt-based money system to money as a public asset. If so, what do you think of it? If not, will you think of it? It is a system change at the root that ends the growth imperative and systemic extraction of wealth. It is what is advocated by organizations from over 30 countries that comprise the international movement for monetary reform, and each are working in their own country. In the US, it's the Alliance for Just Money, etc. All that other information is there for people if they want it. So there's a lot there, Anitra, and yeah. I don't see anyone writing text, so I'm reading these aloud just because it's easier to get it out there on the recording. Otherwise, people who registered for today and can't be here don't know what these are, so they have to be read aloud. So
okay. So had you explained that it's easier for people to put stack in and then well, that's okay. Okay, so I'll just work backwards a bit. Yeah, look, I mean, the arguments for money as a public asset actually just they don't address the real problems that I've identified with producing for a market and then people purchasing from the market. From my point of view, there's a lot of wasted time and energy. You still effectively have like privatized units of production that don't know how many people they're producing for, therefore actually have a tendency to overproduce, and then marketplaces where things can be not enough or they're wasted because too much has been produced. So producing for a known demand cuts out all of these inefficiencies and diseconomies of market economies. So it's not a matter of having community banks. I mean, again, I would argue, great, yeah, try all of these community things, but in actual fact, it doesn't get over these chief problems. And they're also organisations that are exclusive in their own ways. So I also emphasise, that we are facing a really deep and urgent ecological crisis. So whereas 50 or 100 years ago, you might have said, oh yeah, well, why don't we experiment with this? Well, things like community banks as well as cooperatives have actually been experimented with now for well over 100 years. And they're not actually, because they're not actually breaking through the real power hierarchies and the problems with the market system that I've identified. So for that reason, that's why I don't go in that direction. And I also caution people that while I'll say, okay, well, you can do that and it's better than that, but the point is that we actually really need to change the world now, because I can't see our species surviving unless we do. And what we're experiencing in the form of climate change is Gaia fighting back. And, you know, things are getting rapidly worse, and they will get even more rapidly worse. Okay, so look, in terms of small communities and sophisticated technologies, the idea is that there's no bias over technologies, except that they're as user-friendly and convivial as possible. So looking at Ivan Illich's work, but you know, a lot of degrowth work in this area, we're not going to go back to the caves. I mean, that's what I got as the gist of that particular question in terms of utopia. I don't see small and localized economies as necessarily working in a direction of making everything more simplified, but rather more sophisticated in the extent to which we can manage the earth around us, understand it, understand its productive potential, and work with it rather than against it in the exploitative ways that markets do. And yes, you're right. There's someone mentioned about recycling and a variety of other measures that are kind of all working in this direction. That is right. The sort of things that I'm talking about is synthesizing. It's not bringing up something that's brand new. It is, though, talking about something that I believe is not talked enough about in movements, and is not enough a principle within movements, that the potential of actually understanding the power of money and the extent to which us working in non-monetary ways frees us to focus on social and ecological values. And not only that, if we have convincing projects and models that are working in this direction, we just say to capitalists, your system is not meeting basic needs. It's destroying Earth. We want to move in this direction. And it's very clear. And you can't actually be a capitalist in a non-monetary economy. So it actually cuts capitalists off at the knees in a way, which is very important, because many revolutions in the past constantly face resistance in terms of capitalists going on strike and doing this, that, and the other. I mean, so what I see is that we need to have as many constructive examples of this, and as many people thinking about this and working in this direction as possible, because I do think that it has a lot of potential for moving us in a way that enhances direct and participatory democracy. So it answers a lot of questions at the same time. Ecological crisis, inequalities between us that are not just about access to goods and services, but also our capacity and power to be co-designing our futures.
Well, let me see. Anitra, I have a stack question from me. So the degrowth movement also has the related is a co-housing movement, and this is depending on where you are looking by region in a country or in various countries. There is more co-housing going on than in the past. When I did some approaches to a co-housing place in upstate New York, the application for that one, I had to demonstrate that I had sufficient financial resources to participate long term. So I thought, well, they want to degrow, but they want to degrow with only the upper bourgeoisie. And it was the type of resources they wanted someone to have were the resources that someone who does a lot of investment or is a professional like a doctor or lawyer would have, not someone who has had working class work. And yeah. I am wondering, and I do know that you're in touch with all kinds of communities around the planet that are making moves to break from the capitalist imperative to accumulate more, which means making more crap, which means filling up the oceans and the land and the air with what will choke us, drown us, or both in not too far a distant future. But how do we deal with the fact that many of those who are setting up the communities are oblivious to the class questions around this?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question, but the point is that the co-housing movement is, particularly in the United States, it's quite capitalist in its orientation, and it's about ownership. Okay, so I wrote a book called Small is Necessary, Shared Living on a Shared Planet, and I think we had an event here on that. Yes. And in fact, we had one in person, in New York. So in that book, what I do right from the beginning is say, what I'm going to be talking about here are eco-collaborative communities, and I'm looking at best practice, and I'm looking at a specific kind of co-housing, eco-villages, and other forms of collective living and housing. So you can only look at that area in the contemporary world by understanding that there are massive, we live in the free market, so all these people are themselves designing different ways that they can live collectively. And some are like gated communities, and you can't get away from that. And some of the other kinds of criticisms that are made of some intentional communities and co-housing and eco-villages is also that they do tend to attract white middle class, bourgeois. So as I say, my approach to all this is that the best and specific kind of examples of some of these communities actually really show a new way forward in the world. But, there are lots that don't. So I'm not surprised at all at your experience of that, because you actually have to join a community that has the right values, real values in sense. So, for instance, the cooperative that I lived at in central Victoria in the 1990s, you needed nothing to join, okay? But if you did join and you had certain assets, you were sort of expected to contribute some of that. But then equally, if you left, you know, it always, and this was all part of a communal decision-making process, which was just based on people's personal fairness and discussion and everything. So people would leave, and they would actually leave with something that, you know, similar to what they contributed or whatever was decided. Now, Twin Oaks is really interesting to this extent. So, number one, I support entry requirements for people in intentional communities, because you are actually living with other people, and like, you wouldn't expect to even just have a joint household of 5 people without knowing who you're living with or whatever. And it's a very marketplace attitude, or like a boarding house, if you just accept anyone who comes along. And it's, you know, most likely going to end in disaster if you haven't actually got to know one another. So with Twin Oaks, you go and you live there for, you stay there on a visitor program for 3 weeks. And I went there on that visitor program because it's also a program that they allow people like me who just wanted to have a deeper experience of the community to be able to see how they work. And in that 3 weeks, they introduce people to a lot of the main work that's done in the cooperative, which includes a dairy, a tofu making factory, forestry, you know, a range of different bikes made, you know, repaired, and or vegetable gardening, orchards, you know, it goes on and on. So people there, as part of that entry process, get a taste of that. They're living there for 3 weeks, so they get to know what the people is like, what their daily life is like, and everything else. And then if you join, okay, so you're allotted typically in the first place a rather small room, and then the longer you're there, the more likelihood you are to have the possibility of moving to a larger room. But that personal room is actually the boundary of where your personal assets are, or your personal things are. Okay, so I don't think you can even take a bike there unless you're prepared, and unless you throw the bike into the whole collective bikes, and they have a whole collective, you know, collective vehicles of 10 to 15 vehicles of different sizes that are used by everyone, that kind of thing. So you might elect to bring some things, and they just become collective property, and so they stay with Twin Oaks forever. In terms of things that you leave behind in the real world, say you have a house and now you have tenants in it, the expectation is that the rent that you've arranged to get from those tenants actually goes to the collective purse. I mean, this is because you are all living out of one purse. But the advantage of this arrangement is, if you decide tomorrow to leave Twin Oaks, you still have your asset in the real world, in inverted commas, and you just pick up where you left off. And I mean, those, you know, so that there are different arrangements in terms of who enters. And the point is, you don't need to enter with anything but the capacity to work a certain number of hours per week to Twin Oaks. And I think it's incredibly important for a community to somehow have sufficient resources so that entry is accessible to everyone, or because if not, you're already skewing the dynamics of your entire group. Yeah.
Pete Dolak is on Stack. Go ahead, Pete.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Anitra, thanks for this presentation. Very interesting. By chance, just a few months ago, I happened to read the latest book by Michael Albert, with participatory economics that Zero Books have put out, and I guess he envisions, an alternative world more on a national scale where you would have, local councils at, say, the neighborhood level that would go up to city levels and et cetera, all the way out, and it would be kind of like a mass aggregation, as you were. See, it's pretty dark in here. Let me put on my light. Sun's starting to go down in New York City here. So, if I'm understanding you, you seem like you're talking on a much lower localized level, with people being maybe as close to self-sufficient as they can. So my question for you is that the ultimate vision of what you're talking about here, something where people will be in small communities, say a few hundred or very roughly thereabouts, and that everybody will try to be as self-sufficient as they can, although for me it's a little difficult to see how a community that small could be completely self-sufficient, in which case are we talking about, self-sufficiency to the degree that a small community can be, but still having exchanges on a non-monetary basis with other nearby collectives? And if so, how would the exchange between various collectives work so that everybody would have access to, whatever it is that a community or an individual needs?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and yeah, you're right. It's the latter kind of elaboration that I'm talking about. I'm talking about collective sufficiency in local areas to the level that is feasible. What I think is problematic about, is the hierarchical kind of representative vision, whereas I think that various environmental and social movements over the last few decades are demonstrating the extent to which networking can actually mean that there can be extensive participatory democracy over large areas. And, this is where we get back to technology. I certainly believe that we need to be using something like the internet, but just using it at a much more limited scale, or amount. In terms of how these the basic needs beyond, in a sense, your local kind of cell-like community operate, is that you would do that on the basis of needs. Now, if we think about the fact that we need certain things like spectacles or whatever produced, they're only going to need to have plants that would do that kind of thing on a regional, like multi-community scale. And I would see those operating in ways which meant that although they might be on the edges of communities, and they might be a responsibility of several communities, and you would also have people from certain communities that are further distant going there and working there for set periods of time. Now, communities such as Twin Oaks, there's a federation of egalitarian communities that do work exchanges like this, and it offers them something of a holiday. I think that those are ways in which you would have collective sufficiency at a local level, and then you've got networks of conjoined kinds of production happening. And again, they need to be just operating on the basis of needs, like who needs spectacles in that whole big region. And yeah. So does that sufficiently answer the question you raised, or at least enough?
Well, I guess I'm not sure the answer to that, but I see there's more folks on it, so perhaps I'll come back and follow up a little bit later.
Yeah. Look, I'll tell you what. There's the Cooperativa Integral Catalan, CIC, okay, which I refer to in the book, and you can go to their website. They're experimenting with this kind of stuff. They're using their own alternative monies, which I have a critique of, but they're moving in that direction, and so that might elaborate some of that a bit more for you. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I don't see. Let me see.
Harry wants to ask a question.
Oh, Harry, yes. Okay, go ahead, Harry.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So what are your feelings about renewable energies, recycling? What?
Part of your question.
I couldn't hear you, Mike.
We couldn't hear the last part of your question.
Well, I didn't even get to the halfway point, but anyway. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so your conceptions of renewable energy and the possibilities there, recycling and conservation, are all these and new technologies, high form nanotechnology, whatever, that could all these things make a good deal of abundance for everyone? That's still sustainable. That's still sustainable.
The whole sort of direction of having local communities being as communally sufficient as possible is an effort to have the kinds of institutions that enable us to actually be living one planet lives, or less than one planet lives in that sense. Like at the moment, a lot of the kinds of studies of all of this thing are not all that useful, because where do you feed it into the market? What nation can implement what, whatever? A lot of these aspects of scale and of things being big is really counterproductive to us working out what is ecologically possible, in terms of the sufficiency of people on the planet. So with renewable energy, recycling, etc., recycling's okay.
Conservation.
The problem, and conservation, okay. One of the problems with the recycling, in particular, the vision of a circular economy is that, I've seen sort of estimates that about 10 or 15% of what's produced can actually be recycled. So you couldn't have, you could have an economy that attempts to meet up all of these things, but under a capitalist private production market-based exchange, you're not going to. Yeah. It doesn't really come together. in terms of like the problems with the Green New Deal are kind of like similar in many ways. If you're looking at actually, when we're using 1.7 Earths already, which is why we've got all the crises occurring, and carbon emissions are just the tip of the iceberg. They're a symptom. You know, a lot of people seem to just collapse the whole ecological crisis into, if we can get on top of carbon emissions. You're kidding me. This is just a symptom. It's just like the high temperature of a person when they have a fever. It's not the thing which is actually causing all of this. We have to produce and consume less, you know, in countries like where I live, okay, or the majority of people in the country where I live. If we're looking at ditching a whole lot of stuff so that that becomes a whole lot of waste, and rejigging the whole system so that it's running on renewable energy, we're just exploiting the earth more. And so there are massive problems with going in that direction. And one of the advantages of degrowth is basically say, okay, everyone who can, you know, moderate their consumption and the production that they're involved in as well. So one of the principles of degrowth is work part-time. Only work for as long as you need to. And try and be putting your efforts the rest of the week into these more collaborative, participatory kinds of organising both your own production in terms of food. So we've got, you know, certain forms of community-supported agriculture are working with more non-monetary forms of contributions and distribution of the product and that kind of thing. So yeah, look, renewable energy is actually really important. We need to keep the oil in the soil. We're not looking at, you know, a fossil fueled non-monetary economy. But what we are actually understanding is that we're now in a very real pickle, and reduction for those people who can reduce is really, really critical. And turn over to those renewable energies in as ecologically and socially economic ways as possible.
I wish I could respond, but I won't try.
Anitra, I have a second part to my stack, if you don't mind, because I don't want to be dominating the floor, but the title of the book is Beyond Money, a Post-Capitalist Strategy. So we have degrowth communities, we have people who are living cash-free, and there are various other communities, everything from these cooperatives like Mondragon to all kinds of cooperatives going on. Many places are developing aspects of what we do need in terms of reproducing ourselves once we get past the dictates of capital. And what is the biggest dictate capital has? To make more capital. And because the capitalist wants to accumulate more, which means the marketplace of our planet keeps growing. But the book says a post-capitalist strategy. And I do wonder how much we can develop within the confines of capital during our time until there's some type of post-capitalist world. We really have the time to do. And I'm not being critical. I would like to have a realistic viewpoint on how to develop this strategy to a sustainable world, which does mean consume much less, plan much better, I assume this world. I mean, one of the things that I see every day at the supermarket is way too much packaging. There's 14 kinds of Cheerios, and with multiple kinds of bags that all need to be, something needs to be done with all of this stuff within days of eating those oats. And that's like the small part of what is going on. And we have tremendous concentration of those supplying to consumption who are driving people to buy more and more crap. So I like that you're saying beyond money, a post-capitalist strategy, and we do need to think about the world we will have if we can get beyond capital. And I would just like your thoughts on that, if you can, on what we are doing now that relates to what we will do past the period of capital domination.
I have a lot less optimism than you in what is achievable within capitalism. We are now living advanced capitalism. Like, that's what we're living. So really, basically, you can see in front of you what that strategy is achieving or not achieving. I've seen people really exhaust themselves, non-government organisations, whatever, seem to not be able to achieve a lot, not because they haven't got strong will and that they don't put in massive amount of effort. I would say that we really need to be attacking the basic structures of private property and directly controlling and securing our basic needs. And I don't think we have the luxury of time. We just don't have the luxury of time. So, yeah, that's how I see it. And so I just,
Slightly grim. Okay.
Go ahead, Nicholas.
All right. Hello from so-called Canada. I'm in Montreal, Quebec. Climate activist working for climate justice. And, obviously I haven't read the book yet, just got it. I'm working towards my honors thesis, so I already got a stack of book before that. Anyways, I digress. But in terms of Indigenous nations, Indigenous sovereignty, and the land issue, we work on the side of the nations themselves trying to honor their sovereignty of the land, keep projects from going through. How do you see that particular perspective across the globe as being part of what you're putting forward here?
I would see that, I think I kind of said, I believe that we won't just partner with Indigenous people, but Indigenous people can drive this. And within a non-monetary framework, within us all conceiving of that as being a way of going, then Indigenous people's rights are already respected. And in Australia, for instance, only 200 years ago, or just over 200 years ago, this land was covered by around 600 discrete communities with their own languages, who lived on a country which is the oldest continent of Earth and is very hard, in terms of I think we've got an average of 1 inch of soil over the entire country. So eking a living, in a sense, out of this country is very hard. But one of our conservative historians Jeffrey Blaney, wrote a very interesting book decades and decades ago, pointing out that when the first settlers arrived from Britain, they came from a country where people were working, maybe 6 days a week, and they encountered primitive people who were actually only spending probably about 15 hours a day, 15 hours a week to gain, a modest living. And who needs more than a modest living? So this is what we need to be doing. And there are a lot of conservationists, degrowthers, various people in various movements who are actually all contributing to the knowledge and skills of this kind of direction. For me, it's actually, there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of skills, and unconsciously, subconsciously, or consciously, they are actually all moving in a very similar direction. And so in terms of Indigenous peoples, I see them as number one, still being very unjustly treated by capitalism. Still, all look at the Amazon. It's just invasion, right? Invasion all the time on Indigenous people's lands. We actually need a vision of the future like a non-monetary economy, real value one, in order that we can actually even put them into a framework within which we can hold hands with them, and we can actually see that the ways that they live are justifiable. That's how I see it.
So, Lucille, but is capitalism the only form a market can take? I don't think so, Lucille says. The systemic source of capitalism is modern money, institutionalized in 1694. Superseding modern money with just money will establish conditions of the possibility for the move beyond money. We don't get to what you want from here. That's what Lucille put in chat.
Is that a comment?
I mean, it's a comment. It's kind of a comment and a question. Her question is capitalism the only form a market can take? I think that's the question.
Well, if you see a market as being, look, in the book, I address this in kind of like various stages, okay? Because it's a big, complex problem. It's not a narrow and neat kind of problem. There's been a lot of a sense from the work of someone like Karl Polanyi that you could have a market that's somehow constrained or limited or whatever. But I think that the effort to constrain a market would be as or more difficult than what I'm suggesting in terms of a strategy forward. And I can't see it exactly as a step to a non-monetary economy. It's a difficult one, and it goes back to some deep and fundamental problems. Or issues of some theoretical controversy, but in the book, like I follow a view of the rise of money as we know it as a unit of account from several millennia back and it really, money was a creature of the state. So money evolved, coins, okay, evolved in this particular way. The state had various, and these are tributary states. They had the king, the rulers, the authority had peasants who were obliged to give them various forms of tribute in kind. In other words, 10 bushels of wheat, 3 bags of some other kind of product. And they found that depending on flood and pestilence, that certain peasants weren't able to fulfill their annual tribute to the rulers. And so they introduced a system of saying, well, if you can't give us 10 bags of wheat, you could give us 2 small bags of salt. Right? Okay. So they were actually then established a coin for what had then become things that were brought into a kind of false or planned equality, okay? And then actual markets were built on that equality because there were certain people who could say, oh, well, I can give that to this, that, and the other. And then if you have a standing military, soldiers, and other people who are public servants, you've got a market where they can exchange things. So that is kind of like probably could be labelled a state theory of money, but there we are. That's kind of the way that money arises. There are controversies around money and markets and all of this kind of thing. And if I had more time, I could go into each of them step by step. But I can't see, look, we have basically no time. If we think that a non-monetary economy is the ideal, we just go straight there. You get the key and you open the door. You don't just leave the door shut because you just don't think it's the right time, or you could go there in short steps when you have no time.
Mm.
So, Harry, what if we democratically decide to produce only what we determine to be real needs, which includes time off from work? And Megan is on. And Megan, go ahead and ask your question, and Anitra can take Harry and your question at the same time. Go ahead, Megan.
Hi, everyone. This has been amazing, so thank you so much. The quick question, I shouldn't even say quick, that's not helpful, but I've loved this discussion and all of the references folks have shared, but a few times, Anitra, you've referred to like the areas in which policy suggestions such as the Green New Deal fall far short, and I support that vision and agree with it, but I think we have an enormous political challenge because in the United States, that is a Herculean task to pass a bill like that. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts. I mean, and I have not read your book, and I'm going to get it, and I'm very excited to. But if those of us here who are activists and in the sort of working class movements want to really do more in light of all these concerns, can you talk to us a little bit about the Herculean challenges in front of us to enact this vision?
It is Herculean.
Are you talking about enacting the Green New Deal or enacting a non-monetary economy, or both?
A non-monetary economy.
Yeah.
Because it just is a step further, and and to your like the frame of urgency, which is so like artfully constructed here, and I think we feel it all around the world because this is a wonderful global conversation. I think I'm concerned about how we put these visions into action.
Sure. Okay, then. Look, in certain ways, I might be able to kind of address it in both questions in a similar kind of way, because what I want to go back to is talk about Harry's proposition. The point is that if we have private units of production, like I'm assuming that somehow you're thinking that we have a market economy, okay, and we democratically decide what our basic needs are, okay, but how do you actually then get that information to productive units and have them produce what is necessary and it goes to the people who need it? Okay. It would seem to me that if you've got something which is like a halfway house between what we have now in capitalism and what I'm proposing, there are massive problems which are going to go wrong, that people are going to mean that people will ditch the system very quickly. Now, what I want to go back to again is to where we are now in capitalism and how our productive units work. Okay, we have a factory and we have a farm, and in particular ways they work in similarly. Okay, so they have resources. They might have investors, or it might be the person who owns it. Whatever, either way, it's like a credit that they have. Their asset is a resource. Now, they employ people and they produce a product for the market. And because they don't know how many other people are going to be producing for that particular market, at what price, then there are structural pressures for them to produce as much as they can and as low unit price as they can. And that automatically means that you will be operating in order to create a profit. Okay, you have to create a profit. You have to have enough money to pay all your workers, to pay all the people who you've bought resources off, and this, that, and the other. So even before you talk about greed or anything else, the private production enforces that you have profit as a necessary buffer to not become bankrupt or not to be able to pay people. Now, if you're going to suggest some step between this system and the next system, you have to tell me how that step is avoiding that structural conjuncture of pressures. Because you're telling me that you still got a market, okay? So what has happened in socialist states is that you have complicated planning by people who become an elite, not dissimilarly from those tributary states. So you can talk about, simple ways of living as going back to the cave, but unfortunately, state socialism, market socialism falls into many of those traps, and we've seen that.
Oh, Nicholas is back on stack. Go ahead, Nicholas.
Yes. Speaking of networks that mostly speak to need, mutual aid has always been around, obviously, but during the pandemic, it's definitely been, it's touched the mainstream a bit more. I myself am part of a network on, unfortunately, Facebook here, and it does meet people's needs when they have demand, but do you think it could be a good place for organizing politically? Because so far, and I say this as like a tired old queer, it's hard to organize there politically because we're basically scraping by and trying to get everybody what they need.
Yeah, exactly. Look, solidarity networks are a kind of seed to a non-monetary economy. They have many characteristics, but unfortunately, as you're emphasizing, they're also so pressured by the contradictions and the pressures of a market economy and being so much the obverse of it that you're feeling all the pressures that Indigenous people feel when they're trying to work in non-monetary ways. And that's why I'm calling for more discussion about this so that solidarity organisations can feel and start to operate and network more with more solidarity organisations and different people in being seen as part of a strong political way forward rather than a simple charity.
Harry is recommending all groups volunteer to produce some portion of various needs. We determine are needed. If there are some needs being left out, we incentivize those who might then meet the things that are needed but not momentarily available. And related to Harry, I put above there, what about the Detroit problem? And the Detroit problem being a particular one where capital and many were abandoning Detroit. There were vast sections of the city that were where homes were knocked down, all kinds of streets were left to go to field and such. And many people began to produce food in this area that was once home to many auto workers and whatever. As soon as enough of this production became into actually being able to support part of the community, and it was not money based as much, and they had to be money based to sell this stuff. But as soon as they made viable agricultural production in the city, those that owned the ground rent said, we want our land back. And there was a mass eviction of the community getting together, and this was all taken apart. And I do feel that we have to develop some type of strength in these we're beyond peril in our moments, as you say over and over again, Anitra. If we don't do something about the massive problems way beyond when people think of fossil fuels and carbon, what about the multiple bits of strontium and plutonium and such that are circulating, and the choking out of the oceans and the soil contamination, where there's just so much that is wrong, along with the increased militarization and the militarization of the police. So that if we do make these enclaves, and we have almost 8 billion people how can we make enough small communities to satisfy at least 1 billion of us, for the other 7 billion to maybe follow? But there's a lot of planning that needs to come into play here, along with self-defense, because we do know that those that are making tremendous amounts from our excess labor are not going to want to give that up, and they will bring the police and military out.
Yeah, but that problem is against all of our efforts,
right,
to have a just world. So we all face that problem. And in my book, I counsel, nonviolent resistance. But in terms of property, I see that we should be nonviolent in terms of humans, but I think that we have to be developing the arguments from a real value basis that every single person has a right to their basic needs being met. The market cannot do it. It's been trying to do it for 500 years, and it never, ever, ever has done it. We have about 1 billion people who don't get enough food, another 1 billion people who don't get enough nutritious food. Like, come on. We have to develop these arguments and say, unless your system can do that, we take this over. Why not? Because the earth is just kind of crumbling, and so are we as a people, as humanity.
Are you saying this in response to what I'm saying? Because we're just speaking past each other here.
Okay,
none of that applies. I don't see how any of that applies to what I'm saying.
What?
I'm well aware of all these things you just said, and that both Michael and Anitra just said. I'm speaking at a theoretical level, and I'm proposing that we do. And I'm in support of a non-monetary economy.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that in our small communities,
I get you now. I see what you're. Yeah. No, I sort of misunderstood that. Yeah. Well, the point is, I've more or less done that most of my life already, and I know numbers of people who have too. And it just gives us a lot more space to feel like that we can get somewhere, and if more people do that, and this is what the degrowth movement advocates. Now, in the degrowth movement, the non-monetary part of the degrowth movement is a minority, okay? So, but the kind of strategies for a transition are very much just exactly what you're saying, and also asking, using what we already have in terms of the state, for instance, arguing that we deprivatise, that we republicise, nationalise various public services, because none of these things stop that ultimately becoming managed in non-monetary directions. There are ways you can make demands within the current system and using the state that will actually move us in this direction. The biggest problem with the state for us over the last 3 decades, say, is that it's become a neoliberal state, which is working all on a user pays and everything else kind of basis. But if we can encourage those parts of the state and state agencies that are operating in a more non-monetary and fair kind of way, then that's good. So I do think that the trick is, and I like the fact that you've actually raised that now that I've actually sort of understood where you're coming from. There are ways in our everyday lives we can be making steps forward, progressing these things, because the more that those kinds of agencies exist, even within capitalism, the more they make imaginable a world where everything can work like that or whatever.
Yeah, I'm doing what you're doing, I think, which is putting forth the imaginable. Or here's a way we could work it. Here's a way we could do it.
That's exactly right. We need to be extremely practical, extremely realistic.
Yeah, that's all. I believe
in what we do. Yeah, I mean, because basically, I would turn the tables on those people who say, "Oh, this is not obtainable. This is not feasible." I'm sorry, but the last 50 years, I've seen the whole left strategy of working in parties and with trade unions and cooperatives and everything. It's not actually getting us anywhere. We're in a worse position than we were 50 years ago, you know.
And what we're doing is, as you say, totally unsustainable. So, totally unsustainable. So we got to do something else. We got to try something else.
And it's the market. Like, it's actually just a structure. It's systems. It's, you know, not necessarily nasty people or impossible this or God has made people like this or people are naturally like this or any of those real impossible kinds of ways of viewing it.
Lucille asks about nationalizing our money itself. Lucille, what's that?
I still get back to the same thing, that a market structure is inefficient and it's uneconomic, that's the structure itself. It's not who is deciding about what you do with the money or whatever.
So we are at our end. It's already 6 o'clock. Anitra, would you be willing to come back in the summer and say do a workshop on Beyond Money?
Yeah, look, I'd love to. I'd love to, because one of the things that I find most interesting is, you know, people raising these different areas where we can do things and where they have been involved in things. What I try to show in the book and when I talk is that, you know, there are a lot of things happening which are quite unconsciously as well as consciously moving in this kind of direction.
Look, Megan's already saying she'll come back, right, Megan? If we do that?
Yes, indeed. This was wonderful. It's given me a lot to think about, because from the comments from the folks, I know I've had my video off a lot, but from the comments and the folks in the room too, I do feel like we're a cool, like-minded group of folks, and I think many of us are interested in what more we can do to move the conversation along. So thank you so much. This is really wonderful.
Great. I'd love that.
June